Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Sonja Snacken. Sonja Snacken is Professor of Criminology at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium. She is a former president of the European Society of Criminology and was granted several awards, among others the Lifetime Achievement Award of the European Society of Criminology and a Honoris Causa Award by the University of Glasgow. Professor Sonja Snacken's research interests are related to human rights, penology, prison overpopulation, and alternatives to prison sentences as a way of sanctioning people who committed crimes. This interview was conducted on the 7th of October 2022.
Good afternoon, Sonja Snacken, and welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast.
Good afternoon.
So we are happy to have you here. I think we could launch the conversation with our key question: how would you define criminology as it exists in Belgium?
Yes, well, I don't think I want to go into a definition of criminology, but I would describe criminology in Belgium as a quite well-established, institutionalized university degree and research area. With a lot of common multidisciplinary approaches in the different institutes, but with some different accents, both in education and research. And I think that is partly linked also to the history of the institutionalization of criminology in Belgium, which goes back quite a long time in history, and the specific figures at that time that created the institutes of criminology. So I think if you want to know what criminology is about, we should look at the topics and the way the topics are dealt with, rather than trying to define in abstract, I think, what criminology is supposed to be. So maybe to go directly to this institutionalization, there are 6 university institutes of criminology in Belgium. They all started around the 1920s, 1930s, offering a 2-master program in criminological sciences, usually in plural, with a special emphasis on criminal law and psychiatry. So it started at Université Catholique de Louvain in 1929-1930, in Brussels, Université Libre de Bruxelles, 1935, Ghent 1938, Liège 1946. So we see it's all in the same period, and that of course is not just by chance. It's because that was the start of the scientific study of the etiology of crime, contrary to the classical penal theory, which was very simple. Crime is a result of rational choice of people who can think rationally. So that was a period when there were much more questions about this purely juridical approach to crime and criminal law. And in fact, for example, when I look at my own university, well, the VUB, the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, only started in 1969, but we were part of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. So the École de Criminologie was started by Léon Cornille. Léon Cornille was general public prosecutor of the Court of Appeal in Brussels. He became general prosecutor of the Supreme Court. He was teaching at the ULB criminal law, criminal procedure, and criminology. But he was also a member of cabinet of the Minister of Justice, Emile van der Velde, who had been responsible for a lot of innovative legislation. He was also imprisoned twice by the Nazis during the
Mm.
Second World War. The first time because the ULB resisted the Nazification of the university by closing the university down, and he was part of the board and he was imprisoned for that. And the second time, also during Second World War, because he had developed a social fund for judges in need because he had been discharged by the Nazis. And then he was again imprisoned in the prison of Saint-Gilles. So he knew, and he wrote also about the effect of imprisonment it had on his own experience as a general prosecutor, who had always sent people to prison. So you had at the same time this very high level penal lawyer who had personal experience of being imprisoned and who also had this social commitment, like, for example, refusing the Nazification of the university. So that's why after the Second World War, the École de Criminologie was renamed École des Sciences Criminologiques, again plural, Léon Cornille.
Ah,
And this emphasis on sciences criminologiques means that, of course, at that time, criminology was not seen as one autonomous discipline. It was a domain where different disciplines came together. And that's why it was called sciences criminologiques in plural. Of course, there were other people before him, Adolf Prins, very well internationally known, also professor and rector of the ULB, Belgian pioneer of the social defense movement, but also again Inspector General of the prisons. So you had again someone who was a professor at the university, but also was fully involved in the practice of imprisonment. And he was very important in devising the first legislation on parole and on suspended sentence. He was very international. He was president of the Union Internationale du Droit Pénal. Also, some of the successors, like Paul Cornille, Léon Cornille, Paul Cornille, that was much later in 1950s, 60s, but again, professor at ULB and VUB, but also Director General at the Ministry of Justice, President of the International Penal and Penitentiary Foundation, Vice President of the International Society for Social Defense, and so on. So you could say that those people had already a very international profile when they started criminology at our university. And that was the same at the other universities. For example, at the Catholic University in Leuven, it was Etienne de Greve who started, but he was a medical doctor, he was a psychiatrist. And so he started the first École Belge de Criminologie Clinique in 1930. So with much more emphasis, because he was a psychiatrist, much more emphasis on clinical criminology. And you can see that this continued in both universities, for example, even until today. At VUB, we are still very strong in penology, prison studies, prisoners' rights, children's rights, the socio-legal study of the criminal justice system, of the juvenile justice system. Of course, it gradually expanded into very different areas, but you still see that tradition. At the UCL, after De Geef, you had Christian de Buist, who was you could say, a critical criminological psychologist.
yeah.
And much more recently, unfortunately, he passed away very recently, Christophe Adam. So that kind of emphasis, I think, is linked to, is at least partly linked to the history of how criminology started. But you see this international profile. Criminologists at that time were very much involved in all the international debates about etiology of crime, reforms of the criminal justice system, the classical penal theory versus the modern, more positivistic approach to criminality. And in fact, we had a quite famous Belgian school which combined, on the one hand, the classical penal theory based on rational choice for the so-called normal perpetrators, and then the whole emphasis on psychiatry and psychology for those who were considered mentally ill or retarded or perpetual criminals. So Belgium was always very present in all the international debates starting in the 19th century, and was always very much involved in reform discussions. And I think, at least as I feel it, that has had an influence on how we grew up in criminology and how we perceive our duties also, I will come back to that, with regard to policy and practice, which we see as a kind of societal responsibility of academics to be involved in that kind of debates. But to look again at the structure, as I said, criminology at that time was only a 2-year master program. So it would normally be open to almost all university candidatures. That was before the bachelor's, it was called candidatures, and all the master degrees, all the licence, but also gradually to professionals holding degrees, for example, for social work or from police academies. For many years, the training of the National Gendarmerie used to include this 2-year master in criminology in one of the state universities. So they had to go to Ghent or to Liège. They were not allowed to go to one of the free universities like Leuven or Ghent or Brussels. But you see that this was also a recognition of the importance of this criminological degree also for police academies. But what we also saw at that time is that we had a lot of students, as I did myself, who first did a full degree in another discipline and then came to criminology having already a full degree in another discipline. And that would usually be law, sociology, psychology, but also sometimes medicine. And that was because if you had a full degree, you could more or less do criminology in 1 year. So it was very interesting. You could take some optional courses before, so you had already an idea what criminology was about and you were interested. Then you could get a second master degree in 1 year. Of course, that became very, very difficult when we had to reform the whole criminology degree in 1991. And that was linked to the fact that the whole funding of the university programs was changed. And we had to introduce a full degree or we would have lost our master degree. So all 3 Flemish universities, in fact, were forced to introduce a 4-year full degree of criminology, being 3 years of bachelor and 1 year of master, while this was not the case in the French-speaking part. So they kept the old structure of a 2-year master program only for students with a bachelor or a master degree in law or social sciences and so on. So in the 2 parts of Belgium, we have a quite different structure of teaching in criminology. And you can also see that this has had an impact on the number of PhDs, which was very rare in that first period, but became much more normal once we had this full degree, and then it became normal to do a bachelor, master, and then a PhD in criminology. So these political decisions on the funding of universities have had a huge impact on how criminology looks like in Belgium.
So it means that you, in the Flemish part of Belgium, since 1991,
Yeah.
you have 4-year degrees in criminology.
Yes.
Which is quite unique in continental Europe.
Yes, I think it exists in a few other countries, but not in this systematic way. So in many countries, I would say criminology has remained what it used to be in our country, a domain where disciplines come together. Of course, in some countries, and especially under influence of the American history of criminology, it became very much a part of sociology. But in other countries, like in France, it's very much linked to political science, to demographics, to sociology, to anthropology. I think it has also an influence on how you deal with these topics. And of course, again, there are advantages and disadvantages to the 2 systems, as I have known both and was forced to introduce a 4-year program. I would say the advantages of the 4-year program is that you can really offer this multidisciplinary approach to crime phenomena and social reactions to crime from all the basic disciplines. So you have courses in law, sociology, psychology, history, philosophy of sciences. You have several courses on purely criminological theories, who of course will be sociological or psychological and so on, environmental. I think our students have a very good knowledge of how the criminal justice system works, of all the legal frameworks of the criminal justice system. They have a lot of methodology, so they are familiar with both quantitative and qualitative methodologies, although I will come back to that. So they know the different languages that are used in the different disciplines that deal with those phenomena. They know the different concepts. And with our former boss, Chris Eliaerts, I once wrote an article in a Belgian book on what is criminology. And we concluded that because of this, criminologists can act as a sort of interpreter, a translator between the different disciplines or between the different professional actors, because they are usually the ones who know sufficient from all those disciplines to know what people mean when they use a certain concept or refer to a certain theory. And because of this quite unique overview they have, we see that quite a few of our students end up in quite hierarchical positions within police departments or within the criminal justice departments. They are asked to devise policies because they have this overview of the complexity of the phenomena. The disadvantage, I would say, is a bit like, yeah, you could compare it to a general practitioner in medicine. They have this holistic approach. They know enough from all these disciplines, but they don't have the specialized expertise that lawyers or sociologists or political scientists or anthropologists will have, or historians will have. So sometimes they lack this in-depth expertise that the others have. Usually they have not the same high-level methodological skills, especially quantitative skills that sociologists or psychologists will have. And one of the big disadvantages also, I think, is that it has become almost impossible to combine criminology with another full degree. So we lost a whole generation of lawyer criminologists and sociology criminologists and psychological criminologists who all spoke the same language, even if they came from another basic discipline. So we have tried in our university to remedy this by introducing what we call a minor in criminology. So law students now can take a minor in criminology as a kind of specialization in the last year of their law school. So they get several courses in criminology, and then they can still do criminology in 1 year. But they have to take this minor. So in fact, it's still 2 years, you could say. So we have tried to introduce this also in sociology department, in psychology, but it means that those degrees have to be open to this kind of interest. And it doesn't always fit with their expertise, with the topics that they are dealing with, even if it's obvious that we do have a lot in common. So sometimes we have been successful, sometimes a bit less to introduce these minors in criminology. But on the other hand, we see that a lot of lawyers, sociologists, psychologists take courses in criminology again, because they can take an optional course. And there we see, for example, penology and prison law has 3 times more students now than a couple of years ago, and many of them come from these other departments. So I would say that's the advantages and disadvantages of the 4-year program. The 2-year program, as I said, especially if they already have a master degree, then they each bring their own disciplinary and methodological background. They are experts in their basic discipline. And it's very interesting to work together then, because if they have then added criminology, we still speak the same language, even if we come from a different background. If they haven't done any criminology, then it's more difficult because we may use the same concept and not have the same definition of the concept. But the disadvantages, I think, is that, yeah, you don't, in 2 years' time, you don't really have time to go into criminological theories. You don't have time to go in a lot of methodology. So if you come there as a lawyer, you have never had any methodology in social scientific research. If you're a sociologist or a psychologist, you probably have no knowledge at all of the legal frameworks or the criminal justice system. For example, when I started my PhD, uh, I did research based on judicial and prison files. I had never had any course on methodology. So I had to study descriptive statistics on my own in order to do my PhD. So when Chris Elias and I had to develop this 4-year program, we took a lot of several methodological and statistical courses for the students because we thought they really need this to be able to do research, but also for people who do not intend to go into academia, but will go into police departments or in the criminal justice department. And I said very often they come into quite high positions. They will be asked to devise policies or to evaluate policies. So they will also need these methodologies to read about research or even to develop their own research in those capacities. So I think, yeah, the different systems have advantages and disadvantages, but we didn't really have a choice. So we had to live with it.
But from a practical point of view, if you've been delivering 4-year programs for more than 30 years and it is still successful, it means that people find jobs when they get their diplomas.
Yes, there's also a systematic follow-up done by the different universities to see how our students end up in the labor market. And what we see is that they do not immediately end up in the criminological sectors of the labor market. But that's something that you also see for other degrees. You know, many organizations now want someone with a university degree because they think this guarantees certain skills, drafting skills, intellectual skills, and they don't care, you know, whether criminologist or lawyer or computer specialist. So we have, of course, part of our students who end up in jobs who are not directly related to criminology. But sometimes we see that after a couple of years, sometimes 6 to 8 years, they do end up in more criminological oriented functions. And they can even use the experience they built in the other organizations to use it then in the more criminological domains. But it is true that because this program has existed for so long, it is quite recognized. And as I said, yeah, we also have people, for example, who are working for the local authorities, because the local authorities are responsible for prevention programs, prevention of delinquency, prevention of deviant behavior, and so on. So they often hire criminologists to devise those programs and to follow up those programs. And of course, you also have the, I would say, the more traditional criminal justice or juvenile justice functions like police or prison governors. We had a whole generation of prison governors because at a certain point, you could only become a prison governor either through the internal hierarchy, doing exams within the Ministry of Justice, or you needed to have a criminology degree. And that again had an impact on how we could do research, because a lot of the prison governors either were of former students or
Yeah.
again we shared the same language. Of course, they were in a different function and we would not always agree, but they knew what criminology was about, they knew what we were about, they knew what our research was about. And for many years, yeah, we had, for example, a quite easy access to prisons in Belgium, which is again quite unknown in most other countries. And I'm sure that this is linked to the fact that many of the people inside the prison systems are criminologists who know what criminology is about, who know when I want to do research about prisoners' rights, that this is not to attack them, but
Yeah.
because I think we can work together, remaining critical, but working together to, you know, have less detrimental prisons and have less inhumane prisons. And for example, the current director general of the Belgian prison administration is a former student of us. And there is a fundamental respect, I think, because of that. And again, it doesn't mean you have to agree. And it certainly doesn't mean that you should not be critical about policy and practice, but you have a common language. And You can talk to each other. You can exchange views. But that also means, I think, from our point of view, from the university point of view, and at least at the VUB, I don't know so much about the other universities, but we try to do that in a very consistent way. We try to give feedback to the practitioners on the results of our research. So we try to explain what research results were. We try to have a discussion with them, how this is useful for them, and so on. Again, still keeping each other's positions clear, but having this exchange. And I think that that's very important.
But you realize that this is a unique situation for Belgium in continental Europe. For example, if you compare with France, it is what you mentioned. They don't have criminologists, but whenever they talk about the institutions, is to criticize them, to destroy them. So they, of course, the persons working in the institution do not want to work with these so-called criminologists. Eh?
Yeah, but I think now you take the two extremes. You take the extreme of Belgium
Yeah.
on the one hand and France on the other hand. But I think in many other countries, you do also have very important training programs in criminology. In the Netherlands, you have many degrees in criminology. In Germany, in the UK, it's not the same full degree.
Yeah.
But I think they also very often have a similar kind of legitimacy on the condition again that they really aim for this exchange with practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, with the UK, that's what I was saying, continental Europe. In
Yeah,
continental Europe, you can
yeah,
compare
yeah,
to the Netherlands, not with Germany, because
yeah.
Germany, they have very few. There was one in Greifswald and it was closed. I think there is one in Hamburg, if I remember
Hamburg, yeah,
correctly, Lieven.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Then, for example, and if you compare it with Spain and Portugal that introduced these 4 years bachelors
yeah,
maybe 10 years ago, roughly, they are having a lot of problems to find jobs for their students.
yeah,
Because what you mentioned, if you introduce in the career, in the public career, the
yeah,
degree of criminology is good, but this is also a fight because psychologists also protect their
yes.
field.
Yeah, but that's true in Belgium too, you know. Of course, we have criminologists working as what we call justice assistants, and they come in competition with social workers, with psychologists, and you sometimes get lobbying from those others who say, well, those criminologists are just academically trained, they don't have any methodology to work with offenders or with victims. So, of course, we have the same discussions. But I also think you have to look at it in a longer term perspective, because once you get some criminologists in those positions,
Yeah.
they will hire, if they are in those positions, maybe also criminologists from the next generation. And then, I mean, as you say, we started in 1991. It didn't work like that from the beginning, of course, but once you have different generations of criminologists, it becomes also more known. We have criminologists working as journalists. We have criminologists, as I said, in many different departments and areas of society. So
And
that's why I started with that for Belgium, because I understand that this is quite peculiar also for. On the
and
other hand, for example, also the recognition of the discipline. All the universities now, and it started at my university, the VUB, have renamed their faculty of law and criminology. So
so they
that
went
was
back to criminology, not to criminological sciences. Now
no,
it's
now it's criminology, and I think that is linked again to this new structure. Criminology is a full degree. It has a lot of research. It has a lot of PhD. So, of course, we're still based on those different sciences, but it has much more, I would say, its own profile, even if for me, and I think for many of my colleagues, it's still multidisciplinary. And you can wonder whether you can have a multidisciplinary discipline. But who cares? I mean, if what you do is relevant, I think that that's the important part.
I tend to agree with what you say because what you mentioned, they receive a little bit of every science and then they can put it together. It's different that when people say we're going to do multidisciplinary research, and they
Yeah,
engage one lawyer, one psychologist, and one
yeah,
sociologist, and each one does his or her own part, and then they
yeah,
call this multidisciplinary.
yeah.
So, and I have also a question. Sorry, Lieven, I'm monopolizing a little
No,
bit,
no,
but
no.
you know better than me the history in Belgium. But the evolution of the number of students, the trends in the number of students.
It's huge.
Ah, okay.
Is huge, and for all three universities, even more in Ghent and in Leuven, even than in Brussels. But yeah, it is a real challenge. Sometimes we feel victims of our success. Again, because the funding of the universities is so that you only get more money once all those students have finished their degree. So we only get after 4 or 5 years the money we would need to teach to all those students, because we are not financed for the number of students who come into the degree, but only those who end the degree. So for the
Ah,
moment, it's really hard work for. Well, I just retired, but for my colleagues who are supposed to deal with all the students, all the exams. We also all the three universities have apprenticeships, stages. So you also have to do that. It's very important for us because it also guarantees this link with the practitioners. It's also important for the students because they really get their first flavor and experience on the job. They can see whether they like that job or not. Sometimes we have students who are hired after their apprenticeship there. But all this takes a lot of time and energy from the professors. And at the same time, they have to do excellent research and they have to keep, these links with society and going to the media and so on. So, yeah, it's and what we also see, I used to teach in the first year of criminology, despite all the efforts we did through all the information days and information campaigns that criminology is not police academy and is not social work, you still get a lot of, I mean, these people are 17, 18 years old and they have watched TV and they think it's like CSI or they think it's like the police. So they still come with wrong ideas of what criminology is about, and then they get statistics and law and psychology and sociology and so yeah, teaching in the first year is quite frustrating because after 2 3 months you see the number of students just dwindling and you wonder
yeah,
whether it's because of your teaching or
yeah. But
um,
but
but
is
that's a
the
problem with the what criminology, it's quite vague, and many people have a wrong
yeah.
idea of what the academic discipline of criminology is.
I think this is a very important issue. And the strange thing is that now, I mean, students never have had access to so much information about what criminology is and what criminology is not. And the same problem
Yeah.
keeps existing. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, the more information you give them, the less they look at them. They drown in information. I guess that's the problem now.
I'm glad it's not only our experience.
I think it's everywhere.
Yeah, but I think we can't fight the other media, the movies they see and so on. We have, I hear from my colleagues who are dealing with juvenile offenders, they see the youngster coming before the juvenile judge and they say, Your Honor, because they've seen that in American movies that you should say Your Honor,
Yeah.
which was never the case in Belgium, So,
Yeah. When I was in Spain, I had it was before they introduced the bachelor, so I had a lot of students coming from police or from the
yeah.
penitentiary, and they told me, the ones at the police, that sometimes people in Spain would say, "I invoke the Fifth Amendment." The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yeah. Yeah, one of the results of this development is that, of course, we still do have some kind of generational distinction now. I would say the older generation, where I belong to, as I said, we all had a basic degree in a different discipline, and then we came to criminology. And the new generation of professors in my department are all full criminologists, which means they did 4 years of criminology, then a PhD, and so on. So the profile has changed, but I mean, we're still criminologists, and whatever your background and whatever you have done, I think the most important is that we understand each other and we speak the same language. And we see the other movement sometimes now. We have some of our criminologists who then, after finishing criminology, go into law school or into sociology or psychology because they think, well, the type of research I want to do or the type of work I want to do, I would need more from this or this discipline. But then, of course, compared to in the earlier times, it takes a very long time to finish your university. That's the drawback.
I was thinking because we made this interview with Alexandra Zobrininas,
Yeah,
and he mentioned that for him, the first criminologist was Quetelet,
yeah,
from Belgium. And
yeah,
I was thinking that you have like there is
yeah,
well, we can discuss who was the first criminologist, but that's not important today.
yeah,
Yeah, there is this strong link
yeah,
with because Quetelet started working when Belgium did not exist, and
yeah, 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 yeah,
he made the comments in the French statistics and the Dutch statistics. So
yeah,
I think it's quite impressive. Also, the fact that you created schools of criminology or criminological
yeah,
sciences,
yeah, yeah.
which is maybe the institutes of criminology in the UK, but it's quite unique to have schools of criminology since the
But
1930s.
yeah, but that is because the whole emphasis was on education. So
Yeah,
the school was literally a school. It was only education. It was only training. There was almost no research. I mean, the research was done by the criminal lawyers and by the psychiatrists on
yeah,
criminological topics, but in their discipline. So the emphasis was on the school. And the institute refers more, I think, to a research institute. And that came only gradually, I think, starting in the 1960s in Belgian criminology. And by that time, of course, in criminology, sociology was predominant. So we had a whole generation of sociologists coming into criminology. And then later on, yeah, you had to, again forensic psychology coming in 2000. We have now also more this urban criminology that we introduced in our department in 2010. So we have again people coming from social geography into criminology. So of course everything develops in the teaching together with the research and with the topics that you're dealing with in your research, because again it's an academic degree. So it's driven by the research you do yourself and the research that is performed by others in Belgium and abroad. And I think that also explains why there are these different accents in between the different Belgian criminology degrees. So we have this common history. I think we still have a common language. We still have this common multidisciplinary approach, but there are obvious differences then in the research topics that you deal with, and that's normal and it's also good, I think, because then you can be very complementary in what you're doing. There was
there,
one institute that I did not mention yet. That's the maybe you will also ask someone from there, the National Institute for Criminalistics and Criminology, which goes back, I think, to a very old École de Criminologie et de Police Scientifique that started also in 1920s, but was within the Ministry of Justice. And it only started in fact, as an institute for criminalistics. So, it was only in forensic criminalistics. And since 1994, they added also criminology. But that is part of the Ministry of Justice. So that's
yeah,
the Federal Research Institute on Criminology, but within the Ministry of Justice. So they perform also criminological research, but at the request of the penal authorities, sometimes also at their own initiative. But then, of course, it has to be agreed upon by the people responsible for the institute.
and there with that institute, there is a strong link with Lausanne because Lausanne started at the beginning of the 20th century as an institut de photographie scientifique. Then it
Yeah,
became, because Rice was doing that, then it became an institut de police scientifique,
Yes.
That is where the name came instead of
Yes.
criminalistics or forensic
Yeah.
sciences.
Yeah. And the
And then
Belgian
they added,
people came to visit and took the ideas back to Belgium.
yeah, I don't know. There was
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
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 Because
Yeah. Yeah.
there are links there which are quite
Absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
even today, they are still in contact. This is the institute where they put a bomb not so long
Yeah. Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is still this contact, and even the dates. Because, for example, criminology was introduced in Lausanne in '54 as a
Yeah.
course. Then it
Yeah.
became in degree in '84. You say '94. So there is
Yeah. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
link. We should get someone from that institute too, because it's a
Yeah.
nice story.
Yeah, yeah. But the criminologists who are working there are all, again, university trained criminologists coming from one of these six institutes. If they get a PhD, it will be at one of these six university institutes. And so there are quite close cooperations also in certain research projects with this national institute.
And there is something also that you mentioned lightly, and that you and Lieven are well aware of, but for our listeners that maybe do not know the history of the universities in Belgium, this division between the division of the Université Libre de Bruxelles in two,
Yeah,
and Leuven also in two.
yeah,
I know it's a difficult topic, but
yeah.
someone must talk about it once, no?
It's a Belgian joke. Yeah. Well, in fact, the oldest university in Belgium is, of course, Leuven, which started as a Catholic university. And that was for a long time the only university. And then, when Belgium did not exist yet, but was still with the Netherlands, it was decided that there should be a state university that was independent from church, as the Catholic university was very much linked to the church. So two universities were created in Ghent and in Liège to have state universities. But then in 1834, the Free University of Brussels was established to be independent both from the church and the state. And because that was, of course, you already had the Catholic university and you had the state university, so the Université Libre de Bruxelles was established by free thinking. In fact, at the origin also Freemasons. Still the idea that everybody at the VUB and ULB are Freemasons, which is not true, but we are certainly free thinkers. And so the idea was that Belgium lacked this kind of independent scientific institute that could not be influenced neither by church, neither by the state. But then in the 1960s, especially in 1968, with the student revolt, there were a lot of movements, of course, as in many European countries, um, which then led to splitting both in Leuven and in Brussels, the universities in two independent universities, because the Dutch-speaking university in Leuven and in Brussels was part of the bigger French-speaking university. So there was this whole struggle for independence from the Dutch-speaking parts, who felt that they were often dealt with as a minority. Dutch was not a scientific language, and so it was regarded as maybe less important than the French speaking and so on. So there was this whole struggle, in fact, by the students from Leuven and Brussels together. So the Catholics and the free thinking students struggled together against the French speaking dominance to create their own Dutch speaking, Dutch language university. So that's why we have those six main universities in Belgium. And then you have other universities that were created later on in different areas of Belgium, more regional. That's why I would say you have the two state ones and the two free ones, which are the Catholic one and the free thinking one. But of course, the whole regulation is more or less the same. We have to submit to the same criteria of quality assessments, research assessments, education assessments, and so on. So, but for example, the free universities do not have I would say, representatives of the political structure in their board of administration, which I think the state universities have. And we will not have people from Catholic institutions probably in our department, our board of administration, which the Catholic universities may have. So there are small differences, but usually that has no implication on the way we do research or teach criminology or get along with the colleagues from other universities. Always had very good relations with my colleagues from UCL and KUL and the other universities as well. I taught for 10 years in Ghent, so.
No, but you made a perfect summary of the situation, because it was complicated, but you started from the beginning, tack.
Yeah.
Clearly the best explanation I ever had and, about that. No,
Okay.
thank you very much. This is quite important. You gave us a really good overview of this, and then perhaps we could go a little bit to the part of research in criminology.
Yeah.
Which is also, I think, quite different from university to university, and also I think it's difficult to summarize, because when you look at the number of Belgian criminologists attending the European Society of Criminology.
Yes, I find it difficult to talk about the other universities, of course, because I know mainly the colleagues from the other universities who are doing the same topics as I was involved in, and I'm still involved in. So I will start by speaking mainly about my own university. So our research group, and I think the name of the research group is already quite telling, is the Crime and Society Research Group. So we immediately want to show that we are interested not only in crime phenomenon, but also in the whole societal context of definition of crime, reactions to crime, other forms of deviance, and so on. So the Crime and Society Research Group, I would say, how do we identify ourselves? We were asked to do that when we were developing 5-year research program for special funding. And we found during several discussions between us, between the colleagues, that we share what we called a critical, empirical, constructivist, and cultural approach with a clear international, European, and comparative perspective.
Okay, easy to remember.
Yeah. So maybe I'll talk a bit about those different aspects. So critical, empirical. Both the critical and the empirical are very important here. Because I heard Mark Coles in his talk. Mark is a very good friend of me, but I disagree with the way he described critical criminology as a kind of religion or a kind of ideology. And of course, it's essential what he said, and I think Lieven also said it, that the essential thing in science is that you have to assess ideas through research and empirical research. But that is exactly what we do at VUB, and that's why we say we're critical empirical criminologists. And I think the empirical criminology has been a major, but not the only influence. Maybe that's also a distinction between those who consider themselves maybe as pure critical criminologists, but it's obvious that critical criminology again has had a huge influence on our empirical research. And you only find things when you look for it, you know. If you don't look for the interactions between criminal justice and juvenile justice and social justice, well, of course, yeah, and usually you won't see it. But once you start looking for those interactions, then you see empirically the links between criminal justice and social justice. When you study empirically factors of criminalization, then you see the difference between social deviance and legal deviance and so on. If you start from this critical approach, you look at crimes of the powerful. I have been involved for 30 years now in prisoners' rights, prevention of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment in prisons. That's crimes of the state, you could say. Human rights, especially of vulnerable groups, has been at the center of our research for many decades. Juvenile rights, prisoners' rights, mentally ill offenders. We have now a new generation of people looking into older people's rights within the criminal justice system and so on. I think it has also been important in how we look at the actors of crime control because we're also interested in their experiences, in their visions, in how they exercise power, how they experience their power, where they realize the power they have and how they exercise it. So we always had this what we call this multi-actor perspective. So we are interested both in the actors who have the power and who exercise the power and those who are subjected to the power. So once you talk about power, it sounds very critical, but I think again, when you do it in this way, it's very empirical, and I think you need that to be legitimate in the research you do, because well, when people are criticizing you for having this kind of approach, you can show the results of your empirical research. You know that it's not just an ideology.
That's a
So
very good point, eh? And
yeah,
it's funny because we've been discussing this also. There are two things there. I think, yeah. First, yeah, I think that perhaps the denomination critical
yeah,
is confusing because science, Popper said, the engine of science is critique.
yeah,
So it's funny that only a
yeah.
group can be critic. And
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I think
Yeah,
that some of the problems start there, and then also we were discussing also with Alexandra. So he said, "I am a critical criminologist, but not a Marxist,"
yeah,
because the problem was this link with Marxism,
yeah,
and of course, when you talk with the people like Alexandras or Jerzy Sarnecki, who were in these paradise
yeah,
communist places, they tell you a whole different story. So that I think is also
yeah, yeah,
something that that
yeah,
complicates sometimes the discussion.
yeah.
And the last thing is, if you read Foucault, he was not saying that power is always conservative. He was not saying that. And
No,
I
no.
think that today, when you see some governments from the left wing,
Yeah,
they are using the power in the same way as the right wing parties and criminalizing some things that for them are important.
yeah,
But this idea of being critique
yeah,
with the left wing
yeah.
parties is more difficult.
I dislike labeling anyway. We know from criminology that this is always very reductionist. You know, if you label offenders, it's reductionist. If you label scholars, it's reductionist. Uh,
Yeah,
and I think it took me many years also to be able to describe myself as what kind of criminologist I am. I mean, I started in 1979, and only in 2011, for the first time, I wrote this book based on the book I did with Dirk van Zijl-Smit. I did a French version for the Franqui chair at the Université catholique de Louvain, and I argued for une pénologie critique et humaniste. And it was the first time that I dared to say that that is what I stand for, because I thought by then I had sufficient empirical evidence to argue why we would need a more critical and humanist penology. But I would never have dared to do that 30 years ago, because then it would have been ideology. And humanism for me is a basic value, but if you want to use humanism in your science, then you must have a very good reason to do that. And the reasons then again are in the topic that you research. And being a critical criminologist, you must remain critical also towards those values. I mean, human rights have also been described as an ideology. And I have struggled and fought for human rights in prisons for many years. But in my last research for the last years, I tried to assess critically whether human rights really change something in prisons. Does it really make a difference for the prisoners? Does it make a difference for prison staff? Does it make a difference for how we look at those people? So even if you have those values, you should reflect on those values, you should be open about them, and you should remain critical about it. But for many years, I struggled with that. And in fact, when I received the award of the European Society of Criminology, I was so happy because that was what was said, that on the one hand, I was this strict empirical scholar, but also someone fighting for those humanist values. And, you know, as a scientist, you feel a bit strange being also maybe an activist, but maybe that's, you know, not what scientists are supposed to be. But on the other hand, the topics we're dealing with are full of values anyway. So
yeah,
I think it's better to be open about it. And I I like the definition of critical penology that Barbara Hudson used in 2004. So she said critical penologies analyze political choices. They look at the consequences of those choices. They try to think and indicate potential alternatives when they think that the consequences are negative. But you always have to use resources that are within society or within your discipline. It's not just your values. So it's about legal theories, it's about political philosophies that you can, it's about human rights, because human rights are something living in society as well. So I think that's a way you can be a real critical criminologist, but it must prefer, I think, to empirical research as well, and to, yeah, this openness about what values you're talking about. And I think
Yeah,
that's the success of the ESC, because I remember when we started the ESC, I also went to a meeting by European Group for the Study of Social Deviance and Control, and there were quite some misgivings about this ESC, and it sounded like a very governmental European criminology and so on, while in fact the ESC has become, I think, a platform for all tendencies. And I think quite a couple of the chairs of the ESC can be considered fairly critical criminologists.
completely. Yes.
So I think we need the critical criminologists, but we need this plurality of research and of visions, and we have to keep the dialogue. I'm always happy when my more critical criminologist friends, attack me on my prisoners' rights, because that keeps me awake and make
Yeah.
sure you keep thinking critically about what you're doing.
And we need also a forum in which we can discuss, a place where we can meet, having different ideas and discuss openly. Because
Yeah,
the alternative is like the United States now, divided completely.
yeah,
I mean, if you are on this part of the academia, you cannot talk
yeah,
to me, and I will cancel you. So
yeah,
I think, but
yeah,
because you've been at the European Society of Technology for many years, it is something that must be handled with care, keeping this equilibrium, between the different
yeah,
branches of
yeah,
criminology.
yeah, yeah. And of course you also keep responsible in your teaching to give the students a more general overview.
Yeah.
Of course, your teaching will be influenced by your research and by your topics, but I think especially in the bachelor's, in the 3 years of bachelor, you have to give an overview also of the other tendencies.
Yeah.
So it's more in the masters maybe, and of course when people want to do their final dissertation with you, then you can go fully into your own topics, but you are responsible to give an overview of what criminology is also outside your own choices that you have made.
Yeah, I'm really happy with the way in which we can communicate
Yeah.
at this moment. It's not the same in many other. It's not only the United States. If you go to South America,
Mm-hmm.
it's the same. There is a lack of communication, and also the way in which criminology is taught is really biased. So
Yeah.
they are showing only one thing, specific thing, and so
Yeah.
that is
But
a
that's
major
like
issue.
having Fox News versus CNN, It's
Exactly, exactly. They like a lot Luke Holzman, and they are Barata. They are still in South America. There are many of them. Not if you go to Mexico, it's already different. But okay, we're not
yeah.
talking about South America.
No, no,
Let's,
but I think those people have been very important. I think the whole restorative justice movement
yeah, that's
comes
yeah,
comes from penal abolitionism.
yeah,
I mean, it's Niels Christie and Luc Holzmann who started with the penal abolitionism and restorative justice, and now restorative justice is a worldwide development in criminology or in victimology.
yeah,
So I mean, those people had very important insights, very important questions on how we look upon crime, and they were very important in recognizing the experiences of victims. And of course, you can have a lot of discussions, but again, if then you look at it empirically, what are the experiences of victims? What are the experiences of offenders? Do we need something like restorative justice? Do we need a forum where they can have a dialogue outside of the criminal justice system? I think again, it's a very important area in criminology. It's a
yeah,
working group in the ESC as well.
yeah. No, no, it's fundamental to have all these people together.
Yeah,
But there is also something there that. we humans, we change luckily during our
Hmm.
lifetime, a time
Yeah.
span. So, and the
Yeah.
problem is that sometimes people remember one book that one publishes maybe 30 years ago. Then you
Yeah.
change,
Yeah.
and there is no
Yeah.
way to solve that. I didn't find a
Yeah.
solution. Or
Yeah.
you have to keep updating everything that you published,
Yeah.
which is impossible too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
I also think that this has, of course, an influence in the methodologies that we use. We have a predominance of qualitative and mixed methods, ethnographic research, voicing vulnerable groups. Now more and more also going into this, co-creation, collaborative knowledge, visual criminology, and so on. But of course, we also have colleagues who still do quantitative research. But when you look at the majority of what we're doing at VUB, it's more into this, and that of course is linked to this constructionist and cultural approach we have. If you want, we were the first, I think, to look into police culture. If you want to understand police culture, well, you have to go with them for months, and do ethnographic research. So, the questions we have, of course, determine the methodology we have to use. But I think again we are beyond this school discussions between the quantitative and the qualitative methodologies. I hope.
yeah, that's good.
Can I add something? Because I was very much interested in your discussion on humanism and the aspects that you should study. I just think, and that's also my experience after all these years, that we still use outdated concepts. Because if you use the concept of critical criminology, you automatically think of
Mm.
the critical criminology of the 1970s, which
Yeah.
was indeed very ideologically driven. But nowadays, it's about the subjects. It's as important to study
Yeah.
the criminal justice system as a whole, no matter what kind of methods you use.
Yeah.
It's the research problem that defines it. But I think because of the use of these concepts, and sometimes they're politically loaded, that people still have the automatic reflection that, oh, he's a critical criminologist, so he is a member of a church. That maybe that's what Mark Knopfler
Yeah.
was saying in his interview.
Yeah.
Maybe he was referring
Yeah.
to the original meaning of certain types of critical criminology. You can say the same thing about the way of positivist criminology. I mean, I don't think that anybody
Mhm.
who does qualitative research would call himself a positivist because, I mean, that sounds so 19th century determinist. That's a label I
Yeah.
would really, I'm afraid of. So I think it changed a lot, but indeed it defines Belgium. But that's okay because every country needs something. I mean, some kind of specialization, and it
Yeah.
also relates to our history. I mean, indeed,
Yeah, of
institutions.
course.
So
Yeah. Yeah, and in preparation for this, I was looking at the websites of the criminology departments of the other universities, and again, you see that, for example, at the UCL, Université Catholique de Louvain, they also say we're resolutely interdisciplinary, constructivist, critical, and historically situated. We all say that we find it very important to have interaction with policy and practice. So the way you present yourself, of course, say something about probably the kind of research you do. You also see, I think that this is maybe what is common, but I think it's more in the study of particular crimes or phenomena that the different universities vary both in their research and in their teaching. Because over the years, of course, people have developed some specific expertise. I will not speak for Ghent, but of course, for many years, I've been involved in criminal policy, experts on drugs, on organized crime. While in Brussels, as I said, we were much more involved in study of the criminal justice system, of the juvenile justice system. But for example, being in Brussels, which is now apparently after Dubai the most cosmopolitan city in the world,
Wow.
forced us, of course, to also get involved in urban criminology, and we decided that that should become one of research lines because, yeah, in Brussels, you have this is a city of newcomers, of migration. So over the last years, we've been developing research in immigration, in radicalization, de-radicalization. So of course, you go also along with your society or your surroundings. that have also an influence in how you perform your research and your teaching.
So we went through these topics, and another thing that's interesting for us is whether criminology has an influence on the criminal policy of the country, or in some changes that may
Yeah,
occur.
yeah, yeah. Yes, as I just said, I saw on the website that we all explicitly aim to interact and have an impact on policymakers and practitioners, both national and European. So I think that's quite obvious in how we present ourselves, and also say something about the research we do. But for me, there's an important distinction between policy-driven research and policy-relevant research. I think what we have always tried to do at VUB is to do fundamental research that can be policy relevant, or policy relevant research, of course, when it's financed by ministers and so on. But you can go very far into policy-driven research, where you execute, I would say, for a ministry a certain policy plan that they have already established, and that's something I would not do, because then, and I don't think my colleagues at my university would do it, because then you lose your independence as a researcher. So wanting to impact on policy and practice is a continuum, and there are many different ways in which you do that. And of course, as I already said, one of the consequences of the institutionalization of criminology is that we have many students ending up in those departments, going to the police, going to prevention, going into welfare, sometimes in high positions or as policy advisors. So that facilitates exchanges. We also regularly have academics who are directly policy advisors. Marco's referred to it. We also had persons from our university, for example, Christine Kloek was a member of the cabinet of the Minister of Justice when the Dutroux case came about.
But my question is, I see from a theoretical point of view, we would like to have an influence on the criminal policy of the country, yeah? But
Yeah.
in practice, would you say that some of the ideas produced by the criminologists were taken, for example, when introducing a new criminal code, or a new criminal procedure?
The example I gave of Christine Kloek, she was part of the cabinet of Minister of Justice in 1996. She, together with a colleague, developed a very influential white paper and policy plan that was then, for the coming years, the basis of many changes that were performed regarding support of victims, regarding restorative justice, regarding the introduction of the first Prison Act, the whole reform of the parole system in Belgium, and so on. When the Dutroux case exploded in Parliament, they wanted to abolish parole for serious offenders, and she was very important, together with all of us who were giving her scientific evidence on why parole is a better protection of society than not having parole. And I think that's why the minister succeeded in saving parole, even if it became much more strict and severe and so on. So she was able to give those scientific arguments because we were, all working on that. And of course, I myself, for example, have been a member of two drafting committees. So we drafted the two main acts for the prisons in Belgium at the moment. The Prison Act of 2005 and the Act on external legal position, parole, electronic monitoring, and so on of 2006. So, of course, you do that as an expert. I was asked to be a member of that drafting committee as an academic expert, but also because of my expertise in the Council of Europe. I was for many years an expert with the CPT, European Committee for Prevention of Torture. So I was asked to bring in the standards of the CPT and of the European Court and so on into that committee. So you still keep your function as an expert, and you bring it in what you hope then will become the legislation. And of course, once it goes to Parliament, all kind of things happen with your beautiful drafted legislation. But I mean, that's part of the game. You agree to enter into this political game, and then you know what the consequences will be, and it can be very frustrating, it can be very rewarding. But again, I think that's a very personal decision to make whether you should do it or not. But I think several criminologists in Belgium have had an influence on penal policies because of this direct involvement, either as members of the cabinets of ministers or through these drafting of legislation and so on.
And these are very concrete examples that you gave us. So these are
Yeah.
perfect because sometimes it's not so easy. And when you see the legislations of some countries,
Hmm.
instead of improving, there are more crimes that are included. The length of the sentences is longer. So in your case, you
Yeah.
had specific,
Yes, but
very good examples.
that can also happen. For example, with the last Minister of Justice, Crystal Bayens, my colleague, and I wrote a quite critical article in a political journal on the new policy plan of the Minister of Justice, and he asked us for a discussion about it. And he seemed to agree with what we were saying. And then 2 weeks later, longer sentences for sex offenders were introduced. So, but at the same time now he went to Finland and he says, well, we should more look like, having penal policies and prison policies as they do in the Scandinavian countries. And that is also something that we suggested. So, of course, a politician has to take into account other pressures than academics, and there is a public opinion and so on. So it can be frustrating, but at least I was glad he went to Finland and not to the United States like one of our former ministers of justice.
Yeah, but it's interesting this because I am a little bit puzzled. Well, now with the effect of the pandemic on imprisonment rates, this may change.
Yeah.
But if you compare, for example, Belgium to the Netherlands were going down in the number of inmates.
Hmm.
In Belgium, it was not the case, and I couldn't find clear explanations of that. The Netherlands was closing prisons, and in Belgium there were new private-public partnerships for new prisons. Do you have an idea of what happened?
Well, when you talk about the Netherlands, of course, you know that the Netherlands had even lower prison rates before that.
Yeah,
They started having 17 detention rate on 100,000 in the 1970s and 80s. So then suddenly they were increasing. So what we saw
yeah,
the last years was in fact a decrease from the increase that came before.
yeah. Okay. After the financial crisis, and
Yeah,
contrary to all expectations, instead of
yeah,
rising, according
yeah,
to let's say Marxist explanations,
yeah,
they started to go down in many places, but
yeah,
not necessarily in Belgium. I was surprised in 2010s
yeah,
that you could not see this trend, and it was not easy for me to explain. Maybe it's
yeah.
the length of the sentences.
Yeah, well, Crystal Bynes and I devised a schematic overview of all the different factors that influence detention rates. So it takes about 3 hours to explain.
Okay,
So,
okay. No, I know, I know.
so
And I thought that
it's
maybe there was something that
yeah,
escaped me.
yeah. No, no. But what we do see in Belgium is that over the years, the prison population has changed, and that where traditional groups who used to be in prison because of the prison overcrowding were released earlier or other sanctions were applied, we have this phenomenon of foreign nationals without legal permit who are now a huge percentage both of remand prisoners and sentence prisoners. And the research that we have done at our university shows that that is mainly because they don't have a legal permit of residence.
Yeah.
So they are put under remand for offenses that people with a legal permit or Belgians would never be put for in prison because they don't have a permit. And so they're seen as escape risk, they're seen as recidivist risk. And so we have a huge overrepresentation of that profile now in our prisons. And the same is true for the prison sentence because you can't give electronic monitoring if they don't have a legal residence, and the same is for releasing them because although it was not meant to be, the parole system is apparently also applied in a quite strict way to people with this profile. Of course, we know that criminal policy and penal policy and prison policies have a very great influence on how the prison population looks like and the numbers. But what we know is that Belgium in general has much longer prison sentences than the Netherlands. And again, I was asked in Parliament to discuss this new penal code that is being drafted. And I gave the the Commission of Justice an overview. Even in the new penal code, when you compare the Netherlands, Finland, Norway, and the new penal code for Belgium, we're still stricter. And we're still having longer sentences than those countries. So, of course, if you have longer sentences, it's much more difficult. Also, for example, during the pandemic, to go for a stop on the input or to have early releases. It's much easier if these are smaller, short sentences. So it's a very complex.
Yeah, but you clear. I knew you would find at least two factors that play a major role. I know you a little bit over the years,
Yeah.
so that those were. I mean, these are two major issues. They are
Yeah.
also discussing in the podcast with Henrik Tam and with Huberto, but he told me that outside of the podcast that they were surprised by how the typical profile. I know there is not only one profile of a prisoner, but
No.
the typical profile had changed over their years. I mean,
Yeah.
they were in the late 60s in Canada at the
Yeah.
both were at the Institut de Criminology. So they were there in the years of where there was a lot of movement in Europe, and yeah, both said it used to be a guy from a poor class who committed theft, a
Yeah.
national from a lower
Yeah.
class who
Yeah.
committed theft. Do you something similar happened also probably in Belgium?
Yes, I think there are several movements. Of course, we had an increase in the community sanctions, and what you see now is that I think indeed for a small theft without violence and a person who is a Belgian national or has a legal permit of residence, if it's a first time, he would get a suspended sentence or maybe a fine if it's really not very important. So the prison sentence would be only in case of recidivism for a second or a third time.
Yeah.
However, again, I already referred to the Dutroux case, but for example, the Dutroux case had a huge impact on the whole criminal justice system with regard to how sex offenders are dealt with. So the legislation was made more strict with higher sentences. Police became more aware of the situation of victims of sex offenses. So the whole police attitude changed toward the victims with much more openness to receiving their complaints and so on. Prosecution became much more strict for everything relating to sex offenders. The sentences were much longer. Remand custody became almost automatic from the moment there is a sex offense, and parole was made much more difficult and much stricter.
Mm.
So the percentage of sex offenders hugely increased
Yeah.
proportionately in our prison populations because those are the people that were focused on in a much more strict way. And for the first time, we also had people aged 70, 75 who were sentenced to prison for the first time because of child abuse or other sex offenses that in the previous years would not have received the same attention. So yes, obviously there is a change. We also have, of course, again, depending on the region, we have a huge emphasis on the drug trafficking near Antwerp because that's, of course, the international harbor. And we see plenty of young people working in the harbor in Antwerp, 19, 20, 22 years old, getting involved in drug trafficking because they get, I know, 10,000 euros to get some coke in a car, and then they all get 8 to 10 years imprisonment.
Yeah.
So again, the criminal policy and the penal policy is a huge factor in the profile you get in your prisons, of
Mm.
course.
There are two, I think, two very important things that you mentioned there. One, punishment changes over the years. So in the 70s, a local guy who committed theft without violence for the first time would go to prison.
Mhm.
And now, at the same time as we are saying, we have become more punitive and punitive populism, and we talk about that, these cases are no longer going to prison. And this contradiction, I mean, the ones that
Yeah,
go for longer, but the
yeah,
others, maybe they do not go. So it's so difficult to make sense of all this and give
yeah.
a coherent speech, which you managed to do, of course. Yeah.
Well, that's the famous
But
bifurcation policy, of course. But of
it
course,
is,
the sensibilities in society have also changed. There
yeah,
was recently a publication on research done in the Flanders part of Belgium on how the public thinks about seriousness of crime. And again, you see it internationally, it's very much the same results in many countries. And you see that the top of seriousness is everything that is linked to physical and sexual integrity. And
yeah,
everything that is linked to property crime is much below in how people perceive those crimes, which was not the case in the 1970s. We
yeah,
didn't talk about violence in the family. We didn't talk about rape in the marriage. So the public sensitivities have changed, legislation has changed. And I think when you look at public opinion research also in Belgium, when you talk about simple theft, people don't mind if that is electronic monitoring or even better, a work penalty, so community service, let them do something back. That's good, it's better than prison because in prison they just watch TV and do nothing. But if it's about sex offenders or violent crimes, then prison remains the normal reaction.
yeah.
And also for recidivists, I think the prison remains, if you don't learn from the other sanctions, then you should go to prison as well.
Yeah, and this also creates or created a contradiction, for example, for abolitionists, because
Mhm.
the discourse in the 70s was reduce decriminalization, and
Mhm.
now with all this criminalization of all these kinds of violences, I don't see a lot of people there into from the people from the 70s, maybe perhaps because they are already retired, but I don't see nobody. Of course, it's very politically incorrect to say something about these penalties that are imposed in the kind of cases we're talking, but
Mhm.
I don't see a critique of why you impose a different sentence according to the gender of the person. This could be a discussion, no? But this,
Yeah, that's still what we are doing, I think, in our research. For example, we had a researcher doing a quantitative statistical analysis of, I think, 20,000 judgments on drug offenses in the Brussels court. And he found that independent of the seriousness of the crime, the type of drug, and so on, being of Moroccan descent was a major factor in whether you would end up in remand custody or whether you would receive a prison sentence. So this was a purely statistical
yeah,
analysis of 20,000 judgments. Another colleague, Hilde Tubex, she did the research on sex offenders, and she compared the profiles of sex offenders sentenced to prison, interned as mentally ill, and in private psychiatry. And we had assumed that the more serious cases would be in prison and in the internment of mentally ill, and that the less serious cases would be in private psychiatry. But that was not true. The only difference was the social status. The people who could afford to go to private psychiatry and probably also were much more pressured by their family to do something about their problem before the police and the justice got involved. So again, that's why I say critical empirical
yeah,
is very important because that shows that that critique is still the case. Because why are those in private psychiatry and not in the criminal justice system?
yeah,
So of course, in the United States, maybe to say, well, those in private psychiatry should be in prison. No, what we say, if the others can be in private psychiatry, why shouldn't the others not also receive the possibility to go to better treatment in private psychiatry rather than staying in prisons? So the decriminalization, I think, is still important and, of course, has happened in a way. I mean, sex offenses in the 1970s, that was movies that were prohibited because, you know, they were violating the public morals. That was
Yes.
yeah, yeah, that were the sex offenders, you know. I know the theater plays that were prohibited because, you know, there was pornography was highly reprehensible. Homosexuality was a crime. Having birth control was a crime in Belgium. So all these things
Yeah.
have been decriminalized, you know.
Yeah, that's true. The only
But they
thing
have
that
been
is,
replaced by other sensitivity.
yeah, exactly. That's I was hearing Noam Chomsky a few days ago complaining about the fact this is not why we fought for, because now you have to
Mm,
pay attention. They are taking out some pictures, yeah, because it's a new kind of censorship. Only that the things that are censored are different than the ones before, and this I mean it's quite frustrating for me. I To tell you the truth, I never thought that I would see this kind of repression. And you cannot make a joke about this. You cannot
yeah,
mention that. I don't
yeah.
think it's a positive development, but it's my personal opinion.
Mhm. That's
Um,
another topic altogether, I think.
yeah, okay. And but one thing that maybe we should explain to our listeners is because we mentioned the Dutroux case many
Yeah,
times, and
yeah,
I'm not sure everybody knows about
yeah,
Marc Dutroux.
yeah,
Maybe you can explain it
yeah,
better than me. Eh?
yeah, yeah. So this was a huge scandal in 1996. For several months and a couple of years. We had young girls and young women disappearing, never found, and it appeared that this was a doing of this Marc Dutroux with some other people who were abducting, uh, including young girls. And two of those girls were found in his cellar, and he was in prison at that time for something else, and his wife had just let them die from hunger. And in fact, he was found out because one of the other girls, who was I think 17 years old, managed to escape. So two of them were fortunately found in time. But of course, the outrage of what had happened for so many years was huge. It was a scandal because it appeared that some of those failures, both of the police and of the criminal justice system, were linked to malfunctions of the police. Marc Dutroux apparently had been working as an informant for one police department. We had three different police bodies in Belgium at that time who were not really cooperating. So the information on this case that was in one police department was not shared with the other one. So it was found that this case could have been solved earlier and victims could have been saved if the police and the criminal justice system had functioned in a better way. It was also found that the families of those children and girls had had very negative experiences with how they had been treated by the criminal justice system. So there was also, of course, a huge wave of solidarity with the victims. This was a fundamental crisis in the
Mm.
whole criminal justice system for the police, for the judges, for the prison, for how we deal with sex offenders, how we deal with people on parole, and so on and so on. So everything was questioned. And that is why it was so important, as I said in the beginning, that at that time scientific evidence was part of the debate on how we should deal with it. One of our other colleagues, for example, Professor Kozijns, was one of the only ones who had worked with sex offenders in therapeutic programs by that time. And he was also summoned in Parliament to explain, you know, whether sex offenders can be treated or they should just be locked away for the rest of their lives and so on. So I think what was important in this whole emotional, and of course it was emotional. I mean, everyone was emotional. We were emotional. It's the worst thing that can happen, I think, when you see what is done to children. But it was important for us that as criminologists, and while we, of course, fully understood the emotions, we also tried in looking for solutions, how scientific evidence could help to find a solution. And so the colleagues who were working on police were working on police reform. We were working on reform of the parole system and so on. So it remains a very important aspect. And when his wife was released a couple of years ago, the whole parole system was again put into question and was again made more strict and so on. So it remains very important in the Belgian sensibilities and sensitivities.
That happened in the late 1990s, if I remember correctly.
96, 1996.
No, 1996, yeah, because it also had an influence on other European countries. In Switzerland,
Absolutely, absolutely.
we voted,
Yeah,
that it's a direct
yeah,
democracy, so we vote, and
yeah,
there was this initiative to put life imprisonment for
yeah,
sexual
yeah,
offenders of
yeah,
children,
yeah, yeah,
and it was accepted by the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
population. Of course, it had to be adapted because the European Convention on Human Rights does not allow this kind of sentence, so you have to
yeah.
introduce some controls over
To,
the years.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah,
It can be compared to the Bulger case in the UK, which had a huge influence on juvenile offenders. And in many countries, the offenders in the Bulger case were 10 and 11 years old, and they were sentenced by an adult court as if they were adults. And that also led to a lot of changes in other countries. So these cases, of course, are so exceptional, but they are so influential despite being so exceptional. And the problem is that they are influential despite the fact that they should not be applicable to the average offenders,
yeah,
But the force of this kind of extreme events is so strong that it's very difficult you know, to get some balance at that
yeah,
time.
and it's quite impressive how specific events can have
Yeah,
such an influence, terrible as they are, but the history can change for one specific
yeah,
thing. People, when I was a kid, I used to think that there was some logic in the it's not order and progress, like the slogan of Conte and
yeah,
Brazil,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I thought there was some logic. But then
yeah,
it something happens and this changes everything, and
yeah,
and the history of criminology across Europe is like that. Something happened in one country and then it went
yeah,
that way, and in
yeah,
the other it went the other way, and there is no real logic. Sometimes it's random events that happen,
yeah.
and
Yeah, on the other hand, when I was looking into these people who established the schools of criminology in Belgium, you see that they also met, in the international societies of droit pénal and défense sociale and so on. So this policy transfer, or at least the travel of ideas, has always apparently been present in the criminological domain. Um, and of course, that's because crime and punishment are so existential topics.
yeah,
The crimes we're talking about, like Bulger or Dutroux, they're so terrible that they really attack your most fundamental feeling of security as a human being. If that can happen, to a 2-year-old child or to 10-year-old girls, I mean, this is really the denial of almost everything we believe in as
yeah.
as a society. And still, you have to keep the balance in dealing with those topics.
And there you said also something important. Then we have one last question. Ideas travel, as you said, and they were traveling already 100 years ago. People tend to think that it is now because there is the communication, but when you look at the history, the ideas of Lombroso were going everywhere. They were being
Hmm.
applied in Brazil, in Argentina. Gina Lombroso and
Yeah,
Ferrero were going to South
yeah,
America.
yeah.
When you read Gabriel Tarde, La criminalité
Hmm.
comparée, half of
Yeah,
the book is an answer to Lombroso.
yeah.
So what happened is a multiplication. Now you have different events. At that time, there was maybe one big conference, but people were going there, and there were discussions, and the way in which discussions were made, it was a little bit different than the one we have now, but it was there already. It's not that
Mhm.
this is new. There was some European criminology also at that
Absolutely,
time, eh?
absolutely. It was a much smaller group, I think, but but they were influential. But of course, the way politics were made in that time and legislation was made was very different. I think also with the social media now and everything has changed. I think, well, if those people drafted legislation, of course, there would be discussion in Parliament. But it was different, I think, from all the lobbying and the interest groups that exist now that try to influence the politicians. So yeah, I think one of your last questions was what are the key challenges? I
Mm-hmm.
think for me, it's really how to keep our legitimacy as scientists in those polarized times when you see that experts are more and more distrusted and you have post-truth politicians who don't care anymore about not just science but just facts and truth. So for us, I think it has always been important to keep legitimate in the media, with practitioners, with the politicians, with our colleagues, of course. But you see, it's more and more under attack, and it's the same for human rights, for example. I could say someone has described human rights as one of the most important ideologies of the 20th century. But you see now that it's also under attack, and sometimes people label me as leftist because I'm involved in human rights, let alone human rights for prisoners. That must be a leftist stance. Well, I mean, it has nothing to do with left or right. I think the people who are right wing and who would be in that kind of inhumane situations would also want to see their human rights defended. So, but
Yeah.
that's this polarization. I think is something that's really a challenge for all the sciences. We have seen it with the COVID. A lot of trust in the scientists in the beginning, and then distrust is, you know, developing because people don't like the measures anymore, and they think politicians listen too much to the experts, and so this difficult balance between being an expert and being involved with policy and practice and keeping your legitimacy and yeah.
Yeah, but that was incredible what you mentioned about COVID. I mentioned Comte. I think that if Comte would have seen what happened, he was thinking in the 1840s that science will arrive and everything will be solved. And when
Yeah.
you look at what happened with the COVID, so many people denying science. I mean,
Yeah.
the number of people that think that the Earth is flat increased in the
Yeah.
last years.
Yeah.
Who could have thought of
Yeah.
something like that? And I think that some of us are responsible also for that because when we take extreme positions and when we criticize the ones that have intermediate positions, we're not helping the debate. And I think maybe the multiplication of people
Mhm.
talking about crime also led to that, to some people saying, going to extreme positions, both in the right and in the left. And then most of the people do not want a revolution, the
Yeah.
public. They want a quiet life with a family and the kids and a car and maybe or a bike, let's say, or
Yeah.
a,
Yeah.
or a
Environmental.
house. And
Yeah.
so sometimes we put ourselves far away from the common man and the common woman. And I don't know which should be the right thing to do.
But that's why I still consider it a social responsibility of academics to be present in those debates. But that has become again much more complex because it used to be the traditional media. We used to go on television and on the radio and write pieces in the newspapers. But now we have to be on Twitter, and you have to react to the social media, and the social media themselves are becoming more and more extreme. And then you get more and more people who don't want to know any other opinion, and that makes it much more difficult. I still think we should listen also to the people who have extreme
Yeah,
opinions, because we know too much from European history what extremism, to what this can lead. But
exactly. But
if you don't understand the mechanism behind it, you don't know how to tackle it also. But
nowadays,
that's
if you defend freedom of speech, then
Yeah.
they tell you, attention, maybe you're a conservative, eh? So it's so contradictory, so contradictory. It's not an easy time. Maybe it was always
Yeah.
difficult, but yeah, I was
Let's
hearing those who were fighting for freedom of speech in the 70s,
yeah.
like Chomsky, for example. They are
Yeah.
complaining also about that we didn't fight for that. I mean, let them say whatever they say, and then we refuse them if we have the arguments. But now it's very difficult.
Yeah. Well, these are challenging times, but I don't think we would have become criminologists if we didn't like challenges. So
Okay, okay. And maybe our bonus question, because this we discovered that it's interesting to compare. It's
yeah.
how crime has changed in Belgium during your lifetime.
I think I already dealt with it from our constructivist approach. What I said about the changed sensibilities and the changed criminal and penal policies. What I said about sex offenses. People went to prison in my country, medical doctors from my university, because they were performing abortions. Now, sex offenses is centered around consent. Consent has become the main criterion whether something is a sex offense or not. So I think constructivist approach, maybe that has a negative connotation for you, but that is what I mean again empirically. You see how sex offenses were described, how they were prosecuted, how they were sentenced, and how this has changed over those 50 years. And of course, crime has changed, but it's also the way we look at it. As I
Mm.
said, abortion was decriminalized, rape in marriage was introduced, domestic violence. Nobody talked about domestic violence. Of course, cybercrime. We in all the decrease of crime that we see, we have an increase in cybercrime. Of course, that did not exist previously because we didn't have that technology. Drug crimes and drug trafficking, of course, have a huge impact on police and on the criminal justice system in my country. So much so that even some of the most conservative politicians start thinking maybe we should decriminalize it, to get more control over it. We're getting South American phenomena now in the drug scene. Um, what I said about the overrepresentation of non-documented migrants, we didn't have that in the 70s. And these are the people that now have a huge impact on how our criminal justice system functions. I myself, I'm not working with victim surveys or self-report studies, but of course I have looked in some of those data recently for Belgium and for the EU, and you see that in all European countries, the crime tendencies have been more or less the same, starting in the 70s and decreasing in the 1990s and going further down, independent of the level of punishment. So I'm more interested in that phenomenon. How does it come that punishment, although everybody believes that punishment is the only possible reaction to crime, it has so little influence? And what are the consequences that we should take from that for what we do, for what judges do? So I will be teaching
Um,
judges next week on
ah,
is punishing use, and of course it's useful because it punishing offenders has a huge emotional and communicative function towards the victims and towards society. So it has to do with many other things. But the question how crime has changed, I think if you want to have the hard answer, you should ask someone dealing with those kind of data. I'm more interested in how sensibilities changed. But again, empirically.
but yeah, but this has an impact also on theories, because I'm convinced now that some of our theories are good to explain deviance in general, but are not appropriate to explain violence. I
Mhm.
think that we are having these overarching theories that they try to explain
Yeah.
all kinds of antisocial behaviors. I'm
Yeah.
not very convinced about it.
Mm.
And
Okay.
even these trends that you mentioned, yes, property crimes went down, but
Yeah.
violent crimes Of course, the problem is, in part, we are recording more because we are more sensitive. But even when you look at it, it has so much impact on research that everybody's talking about an international crime drop, but when you go to see, south of Rio Grande, let's say, there is no crime drop. And even in Europe, it's very, it's focused on some offenses, like homicide, for example, because Americans think that all violent offenses go together with homicide. It's not the same in Europe. So it's a major challenge.
Yeah, but criminology is so vast. You can't do everything in criminology.
Yeah. So I'm sorry I monopolized a lot the discussion today, but I was caught by Sonja's discussion.
In the discussion.
But I understand, because if you look at the Belgian situation from another perspective, I mean, kind of like logic that you ask questions which I might not see because I'm too involved in the Belgian situation. So, but I must stress that I really enjoyed the detailed way of explaining. I mean, you have, Sonja, much more experience. I'm only a professor for like 15 years or something. So the broad overview is something I still miss. So
that's the advantage of being 44 years in the business, So
exactly,
and still enjoying it.
No, that was really, really nice talking to you, and you were very clear in the ideas. So,
thank
Sonja,
you very much for inviting me. I think it's a great idea, and I look forward to all the other podcasts.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Guyot. Your host are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.